Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Story Deep Dive. This is a podcast where two book coaches, editors, and besties discuss books not as readers but as writers to draw inspiration from great books and have quite a number of laughs along the way. So this week we are digging into the plot of Beautifully Cruel. We have lots to discuss, but as always, I gotta check in with my bestie. So first things first, Dana, what do you got going on over there? Speaking of news anchors, we were talking about news anchors literally right before we hit record, and I went full news, I went my full news anchor voice. I was like, but first, Dana, what you got going on over there? Like, it just went...
Back to you in the studio. Rachel is getting big now.
Oh, man.
You did. It's okay. We are here for all of it. Let's see. Well, I mean, y'all listen, okay? Because every time I think of, we hit record, all the stuff goes out of my ears. But right now it has been really in the throes of summer because y'all, we do record. So we're taking it easy and light in our community. And it's also been a huge time for me for writing. And one of the things that you and I talked about, girl, listen, you throwing up the muscles. I'm like, listen. One of the things that you and I talked about in the pre-show, it was how, I've been working on this sweet, cozy romance. And also, right, I'm still calling it cozy, but I've changed that. And I'm gearing up for the first release under that pen name and having, I guess, the time to really digest the impact of things that I felt like were small decisions, but that had big impacts. And listen, as an editor, I know they're not a small decision. Like there's no small decisions when you're setting up a book. But in the moment, when I would go back and forth, I would just say, here's my decision. I'm sticking to it. And then I would just go from there. And now as I prepare to launch the first book, it's just
yeah.
I don't have any words. It's oh my gosh. And it feels so weird because y'all may not know, and if you do, you know, and if you don't, you will now. I do have several pen names. I like having different pen names.
An unbelievable number of pen names, I would argue. Because every time I turn on, this is the thing. It's it's not just I have a lot of pen names. It's I have a lot of pen names and counting. Because when we met, you had a few pen names. And then over the years...
I didn't.
You had, I think... 2 main pen names.
One, and then started one since it was just the main one.
Okay. So, because I thought that there was your fantasy one as well.
Not yet.
That one hadn't
when we
started.
First
Got
met.
it. So, but over the years, it's every time I turn around, you're so I'm starting this project. I think, Rachel, don't roll your eyes. I think I'm going to start a new pen name. So she is a lady who manages a lot of pen names. Many pen names.
Here's the thing though, right? It's either you want to try a different story and you're putting under the same pen name and you really are mixing either subgenres or you are trying to market a book that is not aligned with the audience that you've built. And sometimes it just doesn't pan out for the long haul. It's just for a few projects and you may find okay, this is not working. There are other times where I'm doing projects because I'm teaching. And the best way for me to really understand is sort of what I'm doing right now, which is to get in there and write and just write. And so every time I say that, I say it with my chest. Because I'm doing it. And, and with this one, I feel like it feels different because all of the others have still been sort of seated in contemporary romance, a regular contemporary romance, even the PNR, right? It's still contemporary. It has the shifters and a little bit of magic, but mostly, it's still a sort of I still think it's more parallel to an urban, right? An urban, I guess you could say it was all an urban fantasy, but we're not going to go there. But the sweet aspect of it,
Yeah.
I think it was a return to my roots, which was different because originally when I did what would have been classified as sweet, I was doing inspirational.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So that is a whole nother thing. So in that, you're talking about faith. And so that feels in some of those, chandelier swinging.
Yeah.
And now you don't have that. You don't have the chandelier swinging. And it's like, okay. And so
What do we do if we're not swinging from the chandeliers? What are we supposed to do with our time and word count?
Listen, inquiring minds want to know. and I kept going back to this thing of like the question of what do I want to anchor this in? And I felt like I knew in the beginning, but another reason why I like writing is because there are some things you don't fully know until you write it. And then you sit back and you analyze them like, okay, what do I have here? And what I had there wasn't, it had a whisper of a mystery, but it was, you would have had to lean in and squint your eyes to really hear it. So I was like, okay, that's not it. And then I sort of settled into this pocket of like very much nostalgic sort of African American romance. And we'll talk about later in another episode of like, well, then that also means to me, like I'm going into a space that does not have a lot of diversity. Mm-hmm. And that was important to me to have that. And so this is where those things that are just decisions that I've made having a big impact, like the diverse cast, the fact that I'm doing small town, but I'm not doing small town coastal. It's not small town beach. And deciding that I wanted to root this in something, and each series is rooted in something a little bit different, but that requires you to have the town and the cast and not leaning into humor as in hardy har like a rom-com. I did make that decision, but there is humor and there's a lot of like dynamic there, but I didn't want it to sort of be couched on that. So those are the decisions that now I just got to stand 10 toes down.
Yeah.
and to see if my ultimate assessment of what I have is also what translates in the marketplace.
Yeah, and right, specifically in this marketplace.
Yes.
Of like this kind of story, which I want to say, so it varies quite a bit for different authors having, how many pen names or whether they split stuff into pen names. But I do think that particularly being in romance, which is very, very subgenre passionate, right? Mm-hmm. Where it is like we niche kind of heavily, contemporary, some tropes even of like, specific kinds of tropes, dark, paranormal, like there's so many varieties, and you make very clear sort of what varietal your romance is in. And so separating that out by pen name, and the reason I'm pointing that out is because for other genres, it's not as common to like split your projects quite so heavily under pen names, right? So like if you write, like if you think about like writing crime, you'll get crime that features an FBI agent. You'll get crime that features a journalist, because we're mostly crime readers aren't looking for, well, I want specifically journalist crime, so I only want journalist crime. So so doing that in romance, and I think a level of necessity to establish your reputation in your varietal so that you can connect with the right readers who are looking very specifically for what you're writing.
Kind of. I honestly feel like it's something that can be an overflow of being independent. And I think it's not a romance thing. I really think it should be across the board. And the reason why is because it's a marketing choice that's being made now. I believe that if other genres did that, it may make it easier to market. But a lot of times what you have is authors begin on the journey from a creative aspect and not from a marketing aspect, and not thinking about, okay, I know I want to write this story, but how will I sell this story? And because you don't think about that, you just do everything you want to do, not realizing that the list that you've built, that those are not the people. When you wonder, why, well, I sent to my list, they didn't buy, because that's not what you were selling before.
Yeah.
And the example that I like to give my students and clients is like, if you are, y'all, I'm gonna date myself. Back in the day, y'all always tell the story, but I gotta tell it to set it up. Back in the day, I remember there was this fast food restaurant that was called Church's Chicken. Okay, Church's Chicken was sort of the counterpart to KFC, which you would know, being from Kentucky, right? Church's Chicken was really popular. And for a split hair of a season, they started serving Mexican food. And I was like, this place is known for chicken. Why are they selling nachos and burritos? Like, I thought it was so weird, but this was the gag. The nachos were the bomb. The nachos were so good. And I wouldn't even examine where they got ground beef in the midst of the chicken. I was young. It was cheap. It was on my way home from school. So for a hen of a season, they had Mexican food. And you were thinking, like, what in the world? Now, fast forward now, having a hybrid store is not unheard of. Here in Texas, you will see a KFC and a Taco Bell in the same building, in the same drive-through. It was just before its time. Now, if I were to have gone out there and said, marketing, come get your chicken, come get your chicken, come get your chicken, and I come to the drive-through and it's like Mexican food, I'd be like, what? Like, I came here for the chicken. Who come here for Mexican food?
Yeah.
And I think that's what starts happening to people when you think about marketing. Back in the day, when someone was traditionally published, their marketing efforts were primarily done by the publisher, right? And they could be a singular author that had multiple contracts across multiple publishers for different things. They could say, hey, do you have any women's fiction? Do you have any romance? Oh, do you have any cozy? They wouldn't have called it that then. And that one author could have had all of those things, but it also would have meant it dilutes their lists.
Yeah.
It dilutes their reach, because what if their list is built on romance? Well, they send that cozy, and a couple people might get it, or a couple people might say, well, I like you, and I might, but that's not how their marketing structure was established. So having the pen names, do I recommend what I do? No, I don't recommend it. Y'all, it's a lot of work. I don't. It's a lot of work. And I don't do it by myself, but it's a lot of work. But for years I did it by myself, and it's because of what I'm saying. But I would say it's a lot of work, so I wouldn't recommend it. But if you find that you want to do things and it may not appeal to the same audience, like, for example, if you're a person, you have sweet romance, and now you want to do a dark mafia, those are different audiences.
Yeah.
It's just, right? And so that's why it does seem a lot, but it's because I'm doing it both as a writer and also as a coach and teaching, and also learning through, aspects of writing. But it also serves on the longer tail of it, of like you continuing to build that list. So me having a list that is, they know it's for diverse romance versus having a mainstream list that is primarily dark romance. Two different audiences. Me trying to sell an African American romance to that list would be very slim. I could still do it and share it, but the likelihood of moving a lot of units is very low, versus being very specific in those lanes. Then I can be in a lot more in control of how I'm marketing and become my own marketing channel for my work.
Yeah, and I wanna make a clarifying statement about what I said. So when I'm thinking of other like non-romance authors splitting off into pen names, I am thinking about splitting off into pen names when you're looking at doing different genres, right? So I'm talking about crime, as in crime isn't subdivided, like crime readers aren't subdivided across journalists, police procedurals, FBI, like in general, like people who like Michael Connelly because they just like crime stories. But if Michael Connelly was going to make a major shift or a major tonal shift, so if he was going to go like cozy, that's when you kind of want to subdivide out, because those expectations have tremendously changed. Same thing if you're like a fantasy writer and you write epic fantasy, and then you want to maybe you decide to go, since and you're like, I'm also going to write a crime story. That is the kind of thing that it's worth branching out in pen name. So what I mean is that it's not as common in other genres, but that it's beneficial, especially if you're looking to make some kind of major shift or experiment with some other kind of work. I think about, I know, now she's also indie, but I know an author who, she writes adult romance, and that's what she writes. But she also writes middle grade. And you know what she does? She breaks out that middle grade under a different name so that nobody winds up in a place they don't want to be, right?
Exactly.
And so, right, you're looking to, you are audience conscious of like, okay, who's looking for this book? If I'm doing a project that it doesn't fit this audience, then like categorizing it under a different pen name, even if you're very public that it's still you, it's just a different pen name, that just helps you kind of segment out your audience, so that also it's a little bit of a service to your audience as well, so that they can find the books that they are looking for, not just like, oh, I know this author, so I want this book, and then they read it and they're like, ah, man, like that's not what I wanted. Yeah. But you can help them find the books that they're looking for, that they are going to like, because that's part of marketing, right? Is like getting your books into the hands of the people who want the kinds of stories you're telling. So helping them, making that as easy for them as possible to opt into your book, to know that this is the kind of book I'm looking for. So I just wanted to clarify that distinction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would. A lot of times people like to use the example of Nora Roberts and J.D. Robb. Right. And even in the beginning, when she did J.D. Robb, they didn't even put on her books Nora Roberts writing as J.D. Robb. Right. They kept it very separate and distinct. Now they do. Right. They do put, writing as, and she probably could cross-pollinate. That's what I always call it, cross-pollinate those audiences. But in the beginning, it's like you sort of get a clean slate. You get to be judged on just the dynamic of that pen name. And the final thing that I would say, which is an added benefit, I think, in romance, is that you do have savvy readers that are looking for that kind of book. They don't care who you are. Yeah. They want that book. Mm-hmm. And I think that makes it a little bit easier for the marketing in the beginning when you don't have a name, right? Mm-hmm. If Nora Roberts, she could just slap her name on something, right? Yeah. We know it. James Patterson, he can slap his name on something, just the weight of his name. And that is a big obstacle and hurdle for someone starting out. But in romance, if you're writing the kind of books that they're looking for, they're not really as concerned with your name. Yeah. Now, once they get to know you and they like you, then they're going to look at the rest of your stuff because of your name. But I think it gets you in the door a little bit easier than some of the other genres.
Absolutely. And another example, now, this is sort of, she's been blacklisted, but J.K. Rowling wrote adult mystery under the name Robert Galbraith, right? And so she wrote that series, but it was under a completely separate pen name. It was also a new project with an effort to say, I want to write this type of book. Can I write this type of book on sort of its own merit, and can it stand on its own, and do people like it separate from my name, right? So there's that, just like you said, that opportunity to kind of like let it stand on its own and see how it does in the marketplace as well.
Definitely. And what about you?
Oh, yes, ma'am. So this week, the Academy is launched. We are rolling. We are moving. We've already done our first month of yeah, thank you. We've identified our idea, we've done our research and our brainstorming, and I basically treat that ideating stage as, first of all, identifying an idea that you want to spend, in this case, the next 6 months with, and identifying something that's exciting, and that also like giving it enough legs so you can take it into the outlining process. And so now this month we are moving into the outlining process where we really start to get into the meat of what is going in your story. So I like to do some outlining to really highlight particularly your external conflict, the external stuff happening in the story, to prep you for your first draft. In my experience, for my writers who haven't written a lot of books, they tend to need to write their way into their character arc. So they might show up with an idea of the arc they want their character to go on, and then they write their first draft, and either they find out, oh, that's not what this story is about, or they need to work with the character and see the character in action to really start to find who they are. And so I take that internal stuff that you discover along the way. Again, the more books you've written, the easier it gets to kind of know what you're aiming for, where you want to head. But for my newer writers, that tends to be really difficult, because it's just like a matter of getting into the story and actually experiencing the character and actually experiencing what's happening in the story. So using the first draft to walk through those external events to kind of work out some of the kinks, where your first draft is very much about discovery, and then pulling that information out of like what you learned from your first draft and using that to write your second draft with more intention. And that's kind of the approach that I'm taking them through, so that you can get that first draft, get that discovery in, find out what you're really aiming to do, and then write your second draft more intentionally. Now that's a couple of months from now, because we're only outlining, but the outlining, we really kind of focus on what's going to happen in the story, what's interesting, using our 4-act structure to kind of curate those events in a way that makes sense. So that's what we're working on this month, and I'm really excited, because it means that that's also what I'm doing with my story and getting some meat to my story, which I'm really, really looking forward to.
I cannot wait to hear about that part. I'm not gonna ask because I know what's gonna be coming, but how does it feel? I know that you've coached a lot of one-on-one, you've coached a lot of group, but this is the first cohort for a story cipher. And so how are you feeling about that?
I am enjoying the absolute heck out of it.
Okay.
So, it's been really, really fun, because I have done a lot of teaching by this point, and I've done a lot of one-on-one work. So getting to crystallize the way that I work with my clients and the way that I have been able to help them move through that process in a broader context, and in a context where we're all doing this together, doing this kind of cohort style where we are in the trenches together. So no one left behind, no one out here on their own, but getting to really dig into that process together and build that community through, we have a shared goal and a shared kind of vision as far as like what we want, has been really satisfying. The group that we have is just absolutely amazing. And we talked about this last week, but I got messages, like images from some of my clients who are in the community, of like their mind maps. Like I walked them through how you create a mind map in a way that actually gives you what you need from it. And I was like getting pictures of like mind maps, and my clients were talking about like how they were like pacing in their offices, and like, kind of staying active in the ideating process. So it was really, really cool to just kind of see that start to come together and see that kind of coalesce into a little bit of something that feels like a community culture, which is something that I really love. So it's been really, really fun.
I'm excited for you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we're having a really good time, and who knows what's going to happen over the next few months, but I'm looking forward to it. And one way or another, I need to have something finished, because that's what I promised. So we're going to have something done in December. Can't wait to see what it is.
You're going to talk about who knows. We know it's going to be some books. We don't know what the books are, but it's going down.
There's going to be something. There's going to be a book, and it's going to be done. So thank you so much. I appreciate that. So with all of that said, let's go ahead and start digging into the plot of Beautifully Cruel. So before we hit our, like, what we're talking about today, will you go ahead and give us a summary for the book?
Yes. Beautifully Cruel by J.T. Geissinger is a slow burn romantic suspense that blends dark romance elements with emotional depth. The story follows Truvy Sullivan, a law student and waitress whose world shifts after she's rescued by Lem Black, a silent, dangerous man with ties to the underworld. What begins as a 28-day arrangement turns into an intimate, high-stakes exploration of trust, control, and desire, with a focused plot, tight POV, and emotional intensity. It's a compelling study in how to write romance with simmering tension and layered character arcs.
Awesome, awesome. Okay, so with that in mind, what are some of the like high level things that you want to hit today before the episode is over?
I would like to hit the fact that this is a slow burn, and we may talk about this towards the end. I think it's a really great sort of beginning look at the sort of obsessive possessive trope that's a popular trope right now, but it's really done in this slow burn sort of style, and that sort of obsession element is what kickstarts us off. It's sort of like the I wouldn't call it the catalyst or even the full inciting incident. I think something else was the inciting incident for me, but it is what brings us to the story. It's like the why now. And, you know, why them, why now is based upon the sort of obsession element that Lem has for True. Also, I'd like to talk about the structure, that 28-day structure. It sort of gives us this ticking clock. And I think we talk a lot about ticking clocks when you talk about suspense, even though I think this is kind of suspense light, but we talk about it in suspense, but to have it in a romance. And so this would be a great precursor to someone writing something like a fake dating relationship, a contract relationship, a marriage of convenience sort of style. And in this sense, it sort of becomes like almost like a forcing function that brings on some of those other big moments, like the forced proximity and them being together. And so having that that constraint, if you will, of that 28-day structure as a part of the story. Another thing, which it's going to be interesting for us to talk about, is sort of the genre approach of this story. I really do think at the end of the day, it's just a contemporary romance, but it's sort of light, you know, morally gray, dark-ish, you know, light mafia romance. And so I think it's sort of on that cusp. And I think there are a lot of pros and cons to that, her sort of straddling that fence that we can talk about. But there are aspects of it that I really liked, and I think there's a lot of readers who want to dip their toe in, let's say, dark romance, but don't want full-blown dark romance. And it's almost like, well, then stay away from it. But who doesn't like a morally gray? You know what I'm saying? So we'll talk about the genre approach. And then lastly, I'm putting it here in plot. I guess in some ways we could have included it in character, but the limited POV. This is what I kind of feel like is one of those secret sauce elements of this story that it took me reading it a couple of times to figure out, like, how was she able to do that? And once I realized, I was, limited point of view. And I think making that choice had some sort of consequences that should have been maybe shored up in other ways later, because having that limited point of view did cut off some of those potential thread lines at the knees. And so it's sort of like a huge con for some, but again, for others, it may be that it was a pro. And I personally like how she did it. I think it could have been done some other ways, but I think it's a very interesting technique that you may want to try. And I've seen her do this in other books as well. And I think it just really depends on the setup. And I guess even thinking about it now makes you have to work a little harder and be a little more intentional. But that is the other thing that I have listed, which is that limited point of view.
Yeah. And I do, I see where that's like, that could definitely, like, technically that would go in character, but because of the way it affects the way that the genre plays out in the
That's right.
plot, it's a plot issue, which is very, very
Exactly.
interesting.
Exactly.
It's a plot issue as in a concern that, in that it concerns the plot. So I just have a couple of things. I'm taking the seat of the acolyte today and just learning from the best, which is you, Dana. So I just have two primary things that I kind of want to talk about, and they dovetail really nicely into your topics. So because you're talking about, this is at the end of the day contemporary romance. And that's what threw me off in the experience itself. So I want to just talk about setting the expectations in Act 1 and how that shaped what I was thinking I was walking into in the story, and which ultimately made me super confused. But by the time I was in the middle, I was like, where am I? What is happening? And that goes with the dipping our toes into dark romance, but also, the potential pros and cons there. So those two will marry really nicely together. And then I think, with the limited point of view, I do want to talk about some of the conflicts that, just like you said, were sort of like cut off at the knees because we stayed in True's point of view and what that did in the story, and where there were things that I was thinking were going to come back that didn't come back in the way that I thought, like in the ways that I thought that they would. And this is really about utilizing the loops that you open in the story to really just generate more conflict and more connections in the story. So those are my two main kind of highlight points that I want to talk about. So I'm thinking that we can start with sort of the light side of dark romance, where we're sort of like straddling that line, since this is sort of one of our primary plot threads. Is that a good place, or do you want to start somewhere else?
Well, I think what you're saying is like sort of starting off with the genre approach, right? I think that sort of becomes a big umbrella here. And y'all, can I just say for the record, because I think this is gonna feel a little bit, because Rachel is like, she likes it, but not really. And I love this book. I love this book. And I think one of the biggest caveats I would start off with is, as you were listing out what you'd like to talk about, one of the things that I love to explore and remind my students of is the reality that not every author you come across has had exposure to writing structure or creative writing. And I'm not saying she does, right? But I think sometimes when we're talking about structure and elements and all of that, like you do have, like I wrote down, like, not all people write, not all people have coaches. Some people just write. They just write the story the way it came to them, and therefore you get what you got. And I think and that's not a bad thing, but I do think when you're having this kind of discussion, and because I picked it on this type of a podcast, it can make it a little bit iffy. But I'm gonna tell you why. I think this story, when we talk about the genre approach, you have the resurgence of, or this sort of tilt towards and lean in towards dark romance. Dark romance, mafia romance is a huge part of romance. And you will have a lot of people that says, oh no, I would never read dark romance, because there are some elements that just don't float. And people will even say, like, why do people like this? Why would this be a fantasy of someone's? But the reality is, it is a huge part of the romance genre. And so when you have books like this that sort of sits on that cusp, it's not full dark romance, but you have a morally gray hero. And I think some of the decisions that the author makes, and I hope I remember it when we talk about characters, is the fact that there are some aspects of why we like morally gray characters that are not sort of seen through to the end, or are sort of skated around, that makes it so that for some people it lands because you still have your happily ever after, and you have your edgy guy and your smart kick butt girl, and this is what you look for in contemporary romance, but it's not what you normally look for in dark romance. And so it's almost as if I told Rachel this example earlier. It's like people who you want soda, but you don't want the calories, so you go for the Diet Coke. This is the Diet Coke. And so, and one of the ways that she sort of picks up with that, I think we could talk about more in characters, which is with the characters, right? So here you have something that's really seated in contemporary romance, but that gives off the impression of dark romance and mafia romance. And through that lens, and even I think, and I put it in the summary because I believe that that's probably how she would classify it. I wouldn't classify it as a romantic suspense. I would classify it as a contemporary romance with maybe a subplot of it, but not an equal like what we've seen in previous book selections. And so having us skirt that line, it can affect everything. It affects the promise. It affects the setup. It affects the characters. It affects all of your major turning points. It affects your climax. And I believe that that's where some of the rub kind of happens here. It kind of almost turns into a con. But I think the plus of it is that if you are the person that you want a little edge, you want a little limb black in your life without all the, listen, this is the cozy mafia. If you want that little bit of an edge, like you want that bad boy, but you don't want him to go all the way, this is what you get. And I think that's what it is. I think, and I also feel like, and this is an assumption, because I don't know JT Geissinger. I don't even think I've even heard an interview with her. But it sort of has the aroma or the essence of someone that was testing, right? Like when we talked about earlier with me having pen names, that you're testing, you're trying to see what lands. Do I want this on the page or do I want it off? What do readers think? What kind of main male character do I want? What kind of female main character do I want? And a lot of those decisions are really made at the genre level. And in this case, not just genre, but the niche, right? The last thing that I want to say about this, and this is one of those moments where, again, I don't know JT Geissinger, but I see sometimes when people decide that they want to write romance, because romance is one of the most popular fiction categories that you can write in, people usually come in it, especially as women writing, like, I want her to be a badass. I am Roman. Hear me roar. She got all the power and he's like her minion and all this other stuff, when the reality is that's not what romance readers want. And that's not usually what is the most attractive and magnetic aspects of romance, that there is a sort of old schoolness to romance. And I think at some points we have a little bit of that sort of rises to the surface. You want True to sort of have this, she's a whippersnapper, but she's still supposed to be shy. And she speaks her mind and she tells it like it is, but she's supposed to be a little bit gun shy. Like it's these weird oxymorons that are going on. But I think it's because there is this dynamic of, as women, we want to be all that and more. But in romance, it really is this dynamic of almost like good old fashioned values. But when you throw in dark romance with a little twist. And so I think sometimes what you'll find is you have that polarizing aspect of it that comes from someone either being really new in the genre, or you really want it to be almost like it's a feminist approach to an old school relational dynamic that sort of can rub the wrong way. Like it will play out really well in your head. It doesn't always play out well when it comes to sales, because people do still like a very strong alpha man. And then having a woman that is, down on her luck, that is very, maybe headstrong. Sometimes it gets in the way, and we have that with True. And I think some of those wires in this story, though, did cross. And it affected how, if you were looking at this structure in this story and in a way that we would if we were doing a diagnostic, it probably wouldn't do very well. But as a reader, I still mess with this one. because I love it. So the point is that is my developmental editor, coach, of genre. But my reader of it is, I totally get it. I get how people don't want to go all the way, but they want to. It's kind of like the difference between your standard mystery and someone wanting a cozy. Mm-hmm. They want the whodunit, but I just don't want to see the blood and guts, right? Yeah. And we want the mental gymnastics, but without all the bullets flying, right? Yeah. A couple of dead bodies drop. We don't focus on it. We know they're there.
Yeah.
Right? With enough distance between it to still be palatable. But I think there are some aspects that this probably could have landed a lot better had the promise and the expectations been set appropriately. And I think the saving grace of all of it was really in the characters.
Yeah. Yeah, that's okay. This helps me because I just hearing you be like, hey, I see where, like, if I were showing up as a developmental editor, I'd be like, hey, I think maybe some of your promises, some of your wires are getting crossed here, so we're not setting expectations the way that maybe you think that you are, the way that you're trying to. Because I know that you love this book, and our previous conversations, I was like, I feel like I'm crazy for being like, these things don't feel like they match up. So just hearing you be like, as a reader, I love it. As an editor, I get it. Like, that helps me not feel like I'm like, am I just like stark raving crazy that I'm like, these things feel off. So I do want to talk a little bit about those promises that get set up at the beginning, especially because I was having this thought as I was taking my notes. So the first thing that I kind of like tracked, right, was, okay, what were the signals that were sent to me in Act 1 that meant that by the time I got to midpoint, I was like, what is this story? I don't understand. Because when we're in Act 1, we have almost like, I don't want to say full like action story or anything like that. Like, we're not, it's not quite selling that, but it is selling maybe a little bit romantic suspense, a little bit like, woman in danger kind of thing. Because we do have, True, I don't think this is really a spoiler. True gets beat up very early in the story. We have a lot of the early narration is like, this guy is dangerous. His world is dangerous. I pulled out the quote specifically. The only way this ends is in blood. Right. So we get these suggestions that are like, oh my God, oh my God, what is going to happen? Yeah. And I'm just like, oh, right. Because we also, even though True is deeply surprised that like, you're in the mafia, we in the beginning, right at the very beginning, we're like, oh, right. Like he's he is in some manner of business that's a little questionable, we'll say. And so all of these things for me were signaling like, oh, this is going to produce conflict, external conflict of like, she's going to be in danger. Like, it's suggesting that there's going to be some suspense and she might be at risk because she's associated with Liam. And we go through the story and we don't see those develop into robust conflicts. So that I was like, I am not sure where I am. So the thing that I was thinking, and I'm kind of curious what you think about this. So the 28 days doesn't get introduced until almost midpoint. It is chapter 13 out of 32 chapters. So chapter 16 would sort of like technically be midpoint. It's chapter 13 when the concept of the 28 days is introduced. I almost wondered if the 28 days had been introduced earlier in Act 1, so that what we know is that the story is about the 28 days together, and it sets this expectation for more of that. This is going to be about us together. It's going to feel more contemporary romance. If that would have because if I had approached this as a contemporary romance, I wouldn't have fussed at it, because I would have been like, oh, well, none of that stuff is supposed to happen, so I'm not looking for it. But because the Act 1 was so heavy on the like danger, gritty, blood, like it's gonna be scary, like rah, I was like, that's what I was primed for, versus understanding that, oh, this is a contemporary romance and he's morally gray, but that's about as far as we're getting into the danger of being around Liam Black. And I wondered if that would have like just kind of helped set up what we should actually be expecting for the story rather than waiting until almost midpoint to go, because then they collapse it down pretty heavily where it kind of it's just like
yeah, I would say maybe. I feel like there were nods to it, right? Because one of the things that he said to her early on when she was in the hospital, he said, I feel like I could ask things of you and you would give them to me even though you shouldn't, right? And that's sort of like later, right? But I think the I am woman hear me roar when he does ask to bring it up, because he's trying to find a way to fit her into his world, even if it's on a in some way, while at the same time not exposing her to his world. And this becomes the solution for that. And it's almost as if we fold into that. And I really think this really feels like the type of story that someone writes when they're not a plotter, right? That you're a discovery writer. That's the way it really feels to me if I were to say it, because you get to the point where it's like, okay, well, you know, you won't, when he comes to see her at the diner, y'all don't want to give things away. When he comes to see her at the diner and she's like, buddy, pump your brakes. That was one of those first things of like, this isn't a line that we should cross. And it really feels like in a real world scenario, you're walking out that decision. And it wasn't until they come back together, first, the intersection with danger that happens with True, and then they again try to walk away, right? Then it's like, then they are at a club, because I don't want to give it away, and then it's like, but you keep coming back, and I keep being tempted by the thing that I'm trying to move away from, but fate and life keeps making us cross paths, and so. In that aspect, I think it works, because think about it. Think about a lot of other romances. And I think this has become something that I've noticed a lot. And I don't want to say it's always, but I think it's an approach. And that when you have a longer story, part of those sort of transition points could be that you change the shift of your forward-facing main trope. Right? Think about when we read things that we never got over. They weren't in a fake relationship.
Yeah.
Right? That wasn't even really even in the cards. Like, yeah, they were attracted to each other, but their differences were just so different. And I think that's one of those moments where you change the dynamic of that relationship based upon changing that sort of forward-facing trope that you're using to a sort of root and sort of anchor that relationship in, which was that sort of contractual situation. And so I would say in general, I mean, I think instead, what I would say about that setup is that it's set up as if it was a romantic suspense, when in reality it wasn't. And the reason why is because you cut it off at the knees by making it limited from Lim Black's perspective.
Yeah.
The moment you made it limited in Lim Black's perspective and Lim Black's world, you cut off all of that. And the fact that a lot of the things that would have been deemed dangerous was cut off.
Right.
Because it was resolved.
Right, right.
So that's one of those moments of when you really look at your overarching plot. What are your subplots? When do you open and close them, and why? And how long can you hold on to that tension? And I think there were some elements where we could have held on to it, and instead of just writing on the revelation of who he is and how it resolves, that really was not a huge factor because we were not in his world.
Yeah.
And so it did, I mean, it was like, oh, I mean, it was a nice, like, but it wasn't like, ooh, because we weren't in his world. We didn't know. And I think she learned a little bit from this because the second book is better about this, but it's also because we have been exposed to their world and we get it. Yeah. And so, so I think I answered your question. I think what happens at the end of the day is that I think you would have probably still felt the same way, even if she said this is a contemporary romance, if the first act would have been set up that way, because it sent off signals. It's kind of like, it's kind of like a dude up in the club and he giving off single vibes, and you look at his hand and he got a shadow from a tan from his wedding ring. Listen.
Okay, I love this this example because I have never in my life run into this instance, but it's very evocative, and you're absolutely, like, it's exactly right, where it's like, you got a guy buying drinks in the club and acting like he's single, and then you're like, was that tan on your, like, are you newly divorced, or?
Exactly. No, she at the house. Listen. So I think what it does is it gives mixed signals. And I think it's one of those things that had those elements landed in a better way, I think this would have been an even bigger book. It is a big book. I think it would have been even better. And so, yeah.
And I think, you know, I think the important thing here is, like, and this actually goes back to this, we didn't choose the books with this in mind, but it really is it pairs really well with One for the Money when we think about how we talked about how she set up what we're getting in Act 1. And so, because we talked about in One for the Money, I was like, I didn't think I was getting a mystery. Like, I was surprised based on the recommendation of someone else. But the moment I saw that inciting incident and I went through Act 1, I was like, oh, this is not that. I know what I'm getting set up for, which is a chase story. And then she followed through on that story and closed her loops kind of in the appropriate order. And this is that illustrating point of, like, being really thoughtful and intentional about what is in your first act so that you are appropriately setting the expectations for your story. Especially, I think about this one as, you know, I didn't know J.T. Geissinger. Like, this is my first exposure to one of her books. So and this is, now we're moving into speculation. I have no idea. For people who already knew J.T. Geissinger, read her books, liked her books, might have just been like, oh, great. Like, they're just along for the ride. And they're like, ooh, I got a little extra spicy, morally gray in my contemporary romance. Amazing. But I didn't know her, so I have no context for her type of story, her type of storytelling, and so I'm just lost in the sauce. And so being thoughtful about how you make that first act to first to set up what this story is about at its core, what readers can expect from it, and then also making sure that you're closing your loops in the appropriate order. So the most important loop closes last, and you're kind of, working your way inward along the way. And that's kind of a really good illustration of that principle in action again, and contrast with One for the Money, I think.
Mm-hmm. I want to add another thing, and then I think this is also one of those things of I find a lot of times when I'm talking to authors, when you look at their first act, they put all this boom, bam, pow. And my thing is always, this is your floor.
Yep. If you're in a boom, bam, pow, which is great, it means that we're going to need more and more and more and more until we get to the end.
You've got to escalate. You've got to go up from here. And I think that's one of the issues here. Right. It does escalate in ways, but it's not escalating in the same thread.
Yeah. It escalates emotionally.
Exactly.
Not physically.
Exactly. And so if you have this promise of, like, oh my gosh, she's getting tossed around and boom, bam, powed up, Act 1. And then after this, it's just like, leave me alone. Like, I'm doing your number, like the sound effects. Then it's like, wait, what happened? Like, what happened to the action? What happened to the juice? And I think that's one of those things too. And but if you see it, it would have been still really hard to see it just as a contemporary romance based upon the way that it was presented, right? With the actual reading. And so, I will say, and then we kind of touched on this when we talked about the sort of 28 days that sort of added this ticking clock. It sort of was this forcing function to put them in forced proximity with each other. And I think it's a great thing because it sort of puts them in the space and you learn about them, but it also does put them in this bubble where you don't get a whole lot of exposure to his world. You know more about him through the lens of his world, like her being sort of on the outside of it. But I think, and it also helped to move it as far as pacing. I think that's why you could kind of say that this is a fast pace, like tightly paced in that regard because of that 28 days. And so I think that was a great thing to be done here. But I think it really more was focused on their emotional progression and the romantic relationship and not the external plot. And I think it would have been 10 times better had, as an editor, y'all, the reader, I was here for it because she was in his world and he was in her world. And listen, all of that happened. But as an editor, I would have loved for the external and the internal to sort of merge with that 28-day sort of structure. And so I think that's what makes it sort of like that sort of pro and con of it. But it was a great thing to put here as far as in the environment of a romance. And it makes me think of, if you're doing fake dating, fake relationship, contract marriage, those types of things, you would want to look at something. But the way that you make it even better is finding ways that it sort of becomes this melting pot, or you merge or solder those other elements of your story to that aspect. And and I think it would have made it a little stronger of an approach.
And I think that goes back to as well, like, letting your internal and external elements rise and fall together, right? Like that's what creates those really, really powerful experiences, is letting those come together. And I think that that's maybe even the contemporary romance aspect of this story, that it's very much more about their emotional progression toward each other. We've got all kinds of chandelier swinging, steamy stuff happening, because this book is pretty spicy. And so like we have those, but so much of that 28 days is about and this is something that I actually really liked about it, is that we had the 28 days, and so we're watching them as the time gets shorter and shorter and shorter, right? As they get closer and closer to the end of the 28 days, this is when they're starting to hit that emotional stride. Like they're really starting to get emotionally connected. They already have that sort of sense of connection, but it's really as we get closer to the end of the 28 days that they start to share the most vulnerable parts of themselves. And so it creates this sense of dread with like the time is ending, but they're getting more attached, which is a great way. I think it's nice to think about, when you've got something like a contract or a fake relationship or something, putting that timeline on it to give it that sense of like, this thing will inevitably come to an end. And that means that it adds that sense of tension and dread, because of course, naturally in proximity, they're going to get closer. And I thought that use of the clock and the emotional development was really, really effective. So if we, just like you said, if we married that with some of that external conflict to just kind of bring in the loops that were opened in Act 1, would have really given it that extra kind of presence and that extra sense of impact.
Yeah, and it goes back to one of your earlier questions. I think had it been introduced sooner, then that would have set your expectation, right? It wouldn't have been boom, bam, pow out of, and sort of like that, put it up here, and versus it would have been this gradual, increase in intensity, because then the reality is we knew it was going to be 28 days, and when the 28 days are up, the agreement is that we go our separate ways or whatever, and now I don't want that to happen, and it brings in another layer of that angst. Right.
Yeah.
And so I think that is what would have happened. But part of this, I think I can understand the mindset of the writer, right? The mindset of the writer is, why would he even think that when that is not what he wants? And that's a layer of his protective nature. That's a layer of his alpha nature. And so you see this protectiveness, and that I am not just protecting you from big bad guys in the alley. I'm protecting you from me.
Yeah.
And you should want it. And in her, her medicated stupor, and in the connection, that doesn't happen. And the other part that makes this book to me super yummy is the fact that, like, he's trying to find all the reasons why not, and all the reasons why. And all the reasons why he's closed himself to relationships are all the reason why that she's so right. And I think this is one of those great books that are a representation of what Michael Haig talks about when he says, like, your love interests see the essence of each other. So here, his representative, if you will, is him being, as they say, the mafia pope, right? But his essence, she sees from the beginning, right? When she feels like, I'm being utterly awkward, I am a loser, I'm really bad at this, he's like, I kind of am too, you know, without saying it in so many words. And I think that's why it works. And so that aspect of it saves the rest. But I think had those other parts been in there, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
But so I see how that can happen. The last part of this that I'll say is the limited point of view. And we sort of have touched on this before. That limited point of view is the fact that you have Lynn Black's point of view, I think almost like a fourth or a third of the time that you have truths.
Very few.
Yes. And that is I felt like that was like one of the aha moments of my life with this book. And it made a whole lot of sense, right? Because it limits our exposure to his world. It limits our exposure to the mafia. And so it's almost like you get the Diet Coke, okay? That he's over the mafia, but we don't get exposed to the mafia. You know what I mean? And it's a weird rub.
We've almost gone from you want soda, but you don't want the sugar and calories, so you get yourself a sparkling water. Like that, we're almost like on that side of like, wow, we really don't get any mafia, do we?
You said the sparkling. Yeah, I would still say Diet Coke, but yes. And I think it was an interesting choice if you were dipping your toe in. I also think it's an interesting choice if you wanted to give people light. I do think that that it is a strategic choice that you just got to say with your chest, and you got to go ahead and walk that thing on out, because it cuts off at the knees a lot of the other parts. The fact that we don't really know fully what he does or how he does it. It does set up the second book in the series. But I would say that it's one of those things where it could be that it was just a choice that you were doing in exploratory writing, that if you were plotting it, you probably wouldn't make the same, maybe. And it does, in the end, make Lynn Black feel more mysterious, right? Because we only have access to what True knows. And True doesn't know anything, right? She doesn't know anything.
God love her. Again, the fact that she was shocked when she's like, he's in the, she's like shocked, and I'm like, girl.
You know what? Because you was already not buying it. Leave True alone. Okay. So there's that. The other part of this that I feel like that sort of was cut off at the knees is like the biggest part, the most, the true climax of this story was based on Lynn. It wasn't based on True.
Yeah.
And you cut it off. And so it almost feels like something's happening, but we can't see it.
Yeah.
I mean, we see it, but we don't. You know what I mean? Like it's this weird thing happening. And I mean, at the end of the day, when you're reading the story, you just kind of have to accept it. And it's like, was that a little bit of a cop out? I don't know. But it kept us at a distance. And so that was another one of those choices that point of view choice made. And it's sort of like what we were talking about in the beginning of this episode about things that I'm going through and choices that I make as a writer. Like making that decision, you've got to see that thing through, and you've got to see that thing through before you write it, or you're on the other side and it's like, well, it is what it is.
Yeah.
And I've read some of her other books, and I've seen her do some things like this before, so I would not say that it is unheard of. I don't know. This is one of the things about it that I don't personally like as a reader, because I like my authors being very consistent. If you want me to one click, she's not a one click author for me because of that.
Yeah. Because
I do. So I have to read the blurb and be fully like, okay, I want to do this. And now my favorite authors, I just buy. And I just can't put her in that category.
Pen names as well.
Right. It does. It does. It does. And so to me, that's one of the reasons why I don't one click her, but I would still consider someone that I really enjoy reading. And I've read some of her series that I really love. I do like to do it as a comparison, if you will, to like a Colleen Hoover for me, because she sort of can jump, she bounces around a little bit. You don't know fully what you're going to get until you're in the story, what aspects she sort of has merged together to tell the story. And I've seen that same sort of quality in J.T. Geissinger. I think the delivery is a little bit stronger, but so I think making that choice is one of those things that you miss out on, and because he was such a dynamic character, which we'll talk about in characters, that we missed out on some of the great richness that we could have had had we had more chapters in his point of view. And I think for that reason, some of the plot was sort of cut off at the knees.
Yeah, and so this is like a good opportunity maybe to just touch on this really, as much as you want to before we move toward wrapping up the episode. But you did kind of mention this sort of light entrance into the obsession-possession trope as kind of the kickoff and the catalyst. And I think it's kind of interesting that we do have that trope and we have so little of Liam's POV. Like, I feel like this is kind of a nice springboard to just talk a little bit about how this trope is used, what to know about this trope, and how it sort of plays out in the book, and maybe even versus your typical, like you said, this is sort of like a lighter version of that trope. And I would love to know, like, what's the standard version of that trope?
I don't even know if there's a standard to it now. It's really popular. I would say in this book, the way that it shows up is the fact that he's coming very regularly just to see her.
Yeah, he can't help himself. He keeps trying to pull away and he can't.
Missing business, all of this other stuff for some reason. And later you sort of kind of feeling like why those reasons were. Again, it reminds me, like it has this aroma of fated mates to me. In PNR and sometimes now in fantasy or romantasy, like that fated mates, fate, soulmates. And I think that's the thing that makes it like a universal fantasy sort of aspect, but it does make it sort of like not fully hit in a structural sense. And you kind of forgive one because the other one is so yummy, right?
Yeah.
And so him being willing to do whatever, whenever, when it came to True. Even to the end of how he handled Oh Boy. I'm saying Oh Boy intentionally so we don't give away spoilers, right? Because of what True wants. And that's where you sort of see that obsessive, possessive, well, not necessarily possessive, but kind of a little bit. You get a little, like a little hint of it, but the obsessive. And in this case, it doesn't seem like borderline, like, oh, it's a little scary. Yeah. That's sometimes what you can get into with dark, where it's like, okay, dude, it's this, in true dark romance, it's this fine line of like, is this right? I mean, ooh. Like, it makes you think. Yeah. Where it's like, ooh. And I think that's the part where dark romance gets people, but she doesn't here. Because the reality is, most dark romance is couched on the fact that your morally gray guy has no desire to walk on the right side. Right?
Which it's conflicted here.
We can't do it without spoilers.
Yeah,
and we can talk about it offline. Yeah. But I think that aspect of it is what keeps it from truly being one of those things that keeps it from truly being a dark romance. And again, it's one of those moments where when you straddle, it's almost like, like, are you really giving this, or are you sort of giving them the sparkling water? Okay, I'm going to tell y'all one more story before we wrap it up. So when my kids were little, we used to give them crackers and tell them they were cookies. Listen.
Wait, you've probably told me this before. I'm almost positive you have, but I haven't thought about it in a long time, so that hit me all over again. I'm like, this is my favorite fact ever.
Listen, I did not want my kids rushed up on sugar. Listen, and so we just kept saying, we would get them crackers and tell them they were cookies, and they didn't know any better.
They're just like, hell yeah, cookies. Nice.
Until one day, my mom decides she's going to keep them for the day. And whenever the kids are with grandma has a whole set of different rules and she had for her kids. We didn't get all those sweets. My kids asked for cookies. My mom's like, oh yeah, let me get you some cookies, baby. She calls me. My kids are bouncing off the walls. Why?
Sway? What's wrong with your kids?
Because they have not had sugar. Not like this. And you're giving them all these cookies. And so it's something like that moment.
It's just like, you should have warned me.
Listen, she's just giving us crackers and telling us they're cookies. And we just want it to be.
And now our brains are all just like razzed and we don't know what's going on. And it's just a whole situation.
And let me tell you the bad side of that. The bad side of that is if you thought you were getting a dark romance and you thought you was getting a mafia romance and you go read a real one, you're going to be like, wait a minute. But that's the real deal. And that's the cookie.
It also means that if you are used to getting cookies and you get a cracker, you're going to be like, oh, hell no. What is this?
That is you. You may not do dark romance, but you do suspense. You do crime. You do the elements that she was giving you cookie. But when you took a bite, it was a cracker.
It was a cracker.
See? And you knew
I feel cheated and fooled.
Give me my calories. Give me my sugar. But that's where you could kind of like get a rub. And I think the way that it can, in the end, work for her is because they are buying into her brand.
Yeah.
They're buying into J.T. Geissinger. And I will read whatever it is that J.T. Geissinger writes in the way that she gives it to me. But it's kind of like when people didn't like sparkling vampires in Twilight.
Yeah.
Listen.
Your Anne Rice fans were like, how dare you turn this into, oh my God. Like you had some outrage because we were like, sparkling vampires. But the people, they loved it. They were like, I want sexy vampire, but not nasty. Like not gross and half rotted. Because of something annoying like logic.
You know what? There goes the one that didn't want the sparkling vampires. It always reminds me when you tell me, Dana, are you sure about using that as an example when you're speaking for the fantasy people? Oh, heck yeah. I ain't stopping me.
And honestly, I respected the hell. I was like, you know what? You get in there, because you know your stuff, so you go tell them. But I just want to check to make sure that you know that the fantasy people might raise their eyebrows. You're like, I don't know that. Get out of here. She went in there. So
listen, don't come for me unless I send for you. That's how I come. Okay, but that's so. Here's the thing. Like at the end of all of this, it's like making sure you're making those decisions and seeing those decisions through. I think it works for her because if someone was to read one of her other books that are a little bit more in the dark romance and then read this, they would still probably love it because they're really great characters, which we'll talk about in the character episode. You really do feel them that in some way she's a little bit loopy, but she's relatable. The point is there are other redeeming aspects about it, and it will make it so overall, it's a positive, some total positive. And I think, and then I think if it's one of your first encounters with her, it's a possible positive for you if you're okay with either or, right? As long as they're strong characters, you kept my attention, blah, 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 then boom, win, And I think that's where a lot of some of that rub comes in. But overall, that's the plot here. And I think at the end of the day, if I had to talk about the plot of this story, that it was almost sort of couched as if it was suspense, but the true plot that was the sort of anchor here was the romance. And a lot of times having a story purely couched on the romance can be very tricky because it doesn't have a lot of concrete anchoring, and that's where the 28-day thing came in that helped to sort of air quotes save that dynamic, but it was so different than what was sold in Act 1. And so that's the part where you want, people who are listening to this. And I have students, especially when we had this book club, people were like, I don't understand why people like this story. Like, I don't get it, right? Or when we go and we read something darker, it was like, oh, wait, give me that. I don't want this.
Like, wait, take it back.
Girl, because we read somewhere, it's like, ooh. And I'm like, this is not even as bad as dark as it can get. Yeah. So I would say just being very clear about that and ensuring that when you look through that, across that thread or through that through line of that plot, that you really do have it escalating across that thread for that particular plot line. And I think just looking for that and ensuring that would have made a huge difference. And I do think I can find ways to say that it's there, but I think if you have to find ways, it's not strong enough, right? That it can be stronger. And I think that if you don't have the power of a lot of marketing dollars and a huge audience, you don't set yourself up for success.
Yeah.
Make sure it's locked and loaded.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think that's like really kind of good, helpful parting words of like, hey, like, especially if you're breaking in, make it as easy for yourself as possible by, paying attention to your setups and, and not letting yourself sort of get away with like, well, if you look for it, it's there. Right. And so, right. And just challenging yourself to pull on those threads. And also like, so you're going to release one book, do better on the next one. Right. And it's also that ongoing growth process of like, if that happens, learn from it, listen, pay attention to how your audience is responding to it, and then make your next book better. And it's so that you don't either get caught in just obsessing over the one project and then no one ever sees it. So you never get you never find out what your audience actually wants or likes because the book it never comes out. And so using that, so even if that happens and you get that feedback from your audience, then you say, oh, okay, like I'll make the next one better. And that's why you write not just your one magnum opus, but you write multiple books and you learn from each one because you actually get better with every book that you write. And so this has been just a great conversation on plot. I feel illuminated. I feel like I understand this story better. So thank you, Dana, for the education on Beautifully Cruel. That's gonna do it for us for this episode. So thank you all so much for being here. We will be back next week where we will do a deep dive on the characters from Beautifully Cruel. And don't forget to like, subscribe. Those are the main things you can do. Like, subscribe, leave us a review on your preferred podcast platform, or give us a thumbs up on YouTube. And
comment.
Comment, yeah, leave us comments if you have questions, or if you read this book and you had you reacted, whether you loved it, whether you hated it, whether you were indifferent. Like, let us know in the comments how you felt about this read, because I promise you we want to know. We are very curious. So thank you all so much for joining us. We'll be back next week, but until then, happy writing.